This isn't going to be a dragged out video about the weekly overpowered comp that you could abuse. As someone who has personally improved from Diamond to Challenger, this is going to be my practical, non-bullshit guide on how you could improve at TFT. In this video, I'm going to try to give you the best real advice on what makes a great TFT player and the exercises I personally do to improve my game. Before I get into the video, I first want you to ask yourself, what do you think makes a great TFT player? Some common answers that I get are stuff like knowing how to play the meta comps really well or having a very good foundation of playing your strongest board. You're partially right, but I would say that these answers only make up 25% of what being a great player is. So here I drew a quick pie chart on what I personally believe represents a great TFT player. I think it's going to be 40% fundamentals. This is stuff like knowing how to identify your strongest board every single turn, knowing how to properly manage your econ, knowing what items to slam early to save HP and what items you should greed for best in slot, and knowing the pace of the lobby and when you should roll and when you should stop rolling because you know your board is strong enough. 20% of it is going to be flexibility. This is stuff like knowing when you should play for top 4 versus top 1 because you understand that the EV for playing for one way is higher than the other. It's also going to be 20% set knowledge. This basically resets every single set because you have to learn every single new champion, best in slot, synergies, what the set mechanic is. And finally, it's going to be 20% patch knowledge. In my opinion, TFT is never going to be a completely balanced game because a patch happens every 2 weeks. And there's going to be a new set every 6 months. So you should always know what comps are strong and what comps are weak for the current patch. In this video, I'm going to primarily focus on fundamentals. I think this is probably the hardest to improve. If I include flexibility, I think this video will take too long. And for set and patch knowledge, you could just watch my other flex videos to get up to date and have a good understanding of what is strong and what is weak. So what exactly does playing your strongest board really mean? I feel like a lot of people throw this term around a lot, but no one really goes into detail about what it is. Here, I prepared a really simple example on what it means to play your strongest board. In this first board, I have a 1-star Taric, a 1-star Ezreal, and a 1-star Leona. And in my other board, I have a 1-star Skarner, a 1-star Ezreal, and a 1-star Aatrox. Which board is stronger? It's pretty obvious that it's going to be my first board because I have two 1-star units that are benefiting from the Guardian synergy. But now what if I told you that the Aatrox and the Skarner are now 2-starred? Now which board is stronger? Now you have to ask yourself, is the raw stats of a 2-star Skarner and the 2-star Aatrox stronger than having the Guardian synergy on my two 1-star units? And after thinking about it, your Aatrox and Skarner board is probably going to be stronger. But now what if I told you that in your other board, your Leona is 2-starred as well? These are the types of questions you need to be asking yourself every single turn if you want to improve. And as the game progresses, when you have to manage 9 different units and 7 different full items, these questions are only going to get exponentially more difficult. So now that you know what playing strongest board means, I'm going to give you 5 rules that you should try and apply to every single one of your rounds in TFT. Rule number 1, a higher cost unit is generally better than a lower cost one. For example, a Corki is probably going to be stronger than a Tristana, and a Diana is probably going to be stronger than a Kayn. But this rule doesn't always apply. For example, if you're in a Xayah matchup, your Shen might actually be better than your Sylas because Shen negates all auto attacks. Rule number 2, a higher starred unit is generally stronger than a lower starred one. For example, let's say you wanted to play Xayah and you're rolling out for Xayah and you didn't hit, but you hit a 2-star Corki. A lot of the times, the 2-star Corki is going to be stronger than your 1-star Xayah. So you would play the Corki until you hit the 2-star Xayah. Similarly, a 2-star Ezreal is going to be stronger than a 1-star Tristana, even though Ezreal is a lower cost unit. But again, this doesn't always apply. For example, if you had a front line that consists of Tahm Kench and Lulu, then in this case, maybe the Tristana would be stronger, even though it's 1-starred, because you have access to Trainer, which gives you Nomzi, and you get access to playing Jinx because it gives you Revel. Rule number 3, an item is generally more effective on a higher value unit than a lower one. For example, if you have a 2-star Ornn and a 2-star Sylas, and you had a Frozen Heart, who would you want to put it on? Probably the more tanky unit, right? Because it's going to be tankier and it's going to give you more value from the item itself than the less tankier one. But again, this case doesn't always apply. For example, if you had a Diana, maybe you want to consider putting the Frozen Heart on the Diana instead because you want to critically think what Frozen Heart actually does. Is it more effective for you to Frozen Heart their frontline tanks, or is it more effective for you to Frozen Heart their backline? Probably the backline, right? So you would probably want to put it on your Diana. Rule number 4, synergies are more impactful generally on higher cost units then lower. So this is going back to the example I had earlier. If you had a Guardian synergy on 2 1-star units, it's still not going to be as strong as having a 2-star Aatrox and a 2-star Skarner. This is because the synergy is essentially wasted on 2 useless units, whereas the raw stats of a 2-star Aatrox and a 2-star Skarner is simply just stronger. Finally, the last rule, you want to have an equal amount of frontline and backline. For example, in this board, you have 4 bruisers. Even though you have this really cool 4 bruiser synergy, it might not be as strong as just playing a swift shot backline, like a 2-star Ezreal and a 1-star Ashe. However, like I said, for all the other rules, it doesn't always apply. For example, if you had a Sunfire cape, or if you get Electro Charge as an augment or a Sunfire board, this basically could count as your backline damage, effectively balancing out your frontline and backline. I highly recommend that you try your best to apply these 5 rules in your future TFT games. Eventually, you're going to see just how different your decisions will change, and this is going to be one of the best ways you could improve in playing your strongest board. So next up, I'm going to talk about itemization, and what exactly is having good itemization in TFT. My personal definition of itemization is going to be, how do we properly manage our items so that we could get the highest possible value out of each component? Notice how I said highest value and not make the strongest possible board. These two things are very, very different from each other. When people first start TFT, I think they're often misled because the first thing that people tell them to do is to learn how to play the strongest comp. And then in that comp guide, they tell you to build X, Y, and Z on Xayah or X, Y, and Z on Corki. And then this gives the player the false impression that TFT is about building the strongest board possible, when in reality it's not. TFT is a game where you have to try and stay alive as long as possible. And this is very, very different from building the strongest possible board. For example, let's say there are only 2 players alive. Player 1 has 50 HP left, which is about 3 lives. And let's say his board has a power level of 100. Player 2 has 10 HP, which is only about 1 life, and his power level is 120. Yes, player 2 has a stronger board than player 1, but you also have to keep into account that player 1 has 3 tries to beat player 2. And in this game, when you're in a 1v1 situation, positioning is very, very important in determining who is the winner of the fight. So if player 1 vastly outpositions player 2, he is going to win the fight even though his board is weaker, and he has 3 tries to do it. So in this scenario, it's actually more likely that player 1 will win the game over player 2. So now I'll give you a better example on what I mean by trying to get the highest EV out of each of your components. So let's say there's 2 players that both want to play towards Xayah, and the best in slot Xayah is going to be QSS, Gwynthus, and Giant Slayer. So player 1, he chooses not to slam any items at all, and he greeds for best in slot. So basically, it's the same thing as him having no items at all until stage 4-2. By stage 4-2, he's at 1 HP, so he slams all of his items, and he has the strongest board in the lobby for 3 rounds. And on the 4th round, he ends up dying because he wasn't properly positioned against the Sin Olaf player, or he's just playing against someone that's high rolling really hard. In this scenario, player 1 will only get value out of his items for 3 rounds, essentially only saving him 30 HP. So now, let's look at player 2. He slams Shiv early game, and then with the rod, he uses it to make Ionic Spark, which are 2 really, really strong early game items. By the end of the game, he doesn't have best in slot Xayah items, but they're still good enough to win fights. In this case, he gets value out of his components for 15 to 20 rounds. If he wins even half of them, he's going to save about 60 HP, which is more value than what player 1 is getting, even though he has the best items for Xayah. This is what I mean by trying to maximize the EV out of each of your components. Although player 1 has a stronger cap for Xayah, he's not going to be able to reach the point where he's going to win the lobby. Whereas player 2 is getting more EV from his item components by slamming strong early game items to try and win streak to play towards late game. Eventually, player 2 will outscale player 1, not because he has better items, but because he has more resources to work with, like gold, units, time, because by this time, player 1 will already be dead. So to get better itemization, I compiled a list of notes that you should always keep in mind when you get dropped certain components. Every time you get a component, you want to think about the following things. Is slamming this suboptimal item getting me more value than greeting for best in slot? For example, slamming Static Shiv and Spark instead of greeting for Gwynthus, GS, and QSS for Xayah? Does slamming a certain item lock me out of a certain comp? For example, if you only have 1 glove and you decide to slam Beast Gloves, you're probably not going to be playing Sin Olaf. Is a certain item absolutely necessary for a certain comp? An example of this is if you're trying to play Ao Shin and you have 1 tier. If you use that tier to slam Redemption, you're probably not going to be playing Ao Shin because Ao Shin needs Shojin to go off. And let's say there's a scenario where you get dropped a bunch of useless items. The way you should be thinking about it is, how can I get the most value out of these items by killing off these components? So let's say you're currently trying to play towards Rise or Aoshin, and you have a Shojin and Shiv, and you out of nowhere get Mortdog, then you get drop 2 bows. What do? How you should be thinking about it is, what items can I make with a bow that gives my team value that is not absolutely useless for the comp that I'm playing? Even though I'm playing AP, I can make Giant Slayer, which uses bow, which is pretty good, but there's no other really good bow item that I could make. So this remaining 1 extra bow needs to go towards something else that's not damage. So I need to grab a belt from Carousel to slam ZZ Rot to get value out of this bow. If these are too advanced for you to think about right now, you could just follow this basic principle. If you have 4 components on bench, you always slam something, and if you have 3 components, you almost always slam. So next, I'll just briefly touch up on Econ. I think this is one of the more simpler skills you could learn and master. In my opinion, Econ consists of the following. It's basically knowing exactly when and what you should spend your money on throughout the entire TFT game. So this could be something like knowing exactly when you should level, knowing why you should level, knowing when and why you should roll, knowing what units you should hold, and stuff like knowing when you should make a certain econ interval versus holding pairs. So when I first started out learning about econ, the easiest way that I improved at this was to follow these 3 routes. There is a win streak route, a lose streak route, and a normal win-lose route that you should follow. Keep in mind that these are templates, and if you're a beginner, I recommend just following these templates and you'll find really, really good results. I also recommend that you stick to playing level 8 comps like Xayah and Corki, because playing these comps, even though they might not be the strongest at some point in the meta, they're going to help you understand how to properly manage your economy in the best possible way. In my opinion, reroll comps, they're very good at teaching you tempo, but not very good for econ, because reroll comps, there aren't that many decisions on when you should level and when you should roll. The decisions for these are very, very easy and predetermined, whereas these fast 8 comps, there's a lot of different decisions you can make on what you should do with your gold. Eventually, as you start getting used to these playstyles, I highly recommend you start asking yourself why you should level here for each of these stages, because the more you ask about why you make a certain decision, the more insights you get that you could apply to similar but different scenarios. For example, why do we level to 7 here at stage 3-5? Well, the answer to this is because you're on a 7 win streak, you're going to be making 3 gold per turn, and if you level to 7 here, you go down to 20 gold, you lose an extra 3 gold of interest per turn because you break the 50 gold interval, but you get it back if you keep winning. So in essence, you're making the same amount of money as a level 6 at 50 gold, except you're going to be winning the fights that you shouldn't have by having 1 extra unit in your team comp. So now, because you thought of this decision, all of a sudden you get this insight. For every turn you're not 50 gold, you need to pay an extra X amount of gold per turn. Now that you have this insight, let's look at a very different scenario. Let's say you're at 20 gold and you see a Corki in the shop that costs 4 gold. However, Corki is not part of your strongest board. Do you buy this Corki? And the answer is no. Because you have this insight, you realize that this Corki isn't actually priced at 4 gold. It's more closely priced to something like 7 or 8 gold, because for every round you hold the Corki, you're not making the next econ threshold. So due to how compound interest works, you're basically paying 8 gold for a unit you might not even play late game. When you roll down at stage 4-5 and you find a Corki that's worth 8 gold, are you going to buy this Corki? The answer is probably not. So if you get this Corki at stage 2-5 and it's not part of your strongest board, you are probably not buying this Corki if it breaks your 20 gold interval, because it's essentially going to cost you 8 gold. So my final recommendation on getting better at econ management is playing around these 3 templates, playing more fast 8 comps, and trying to understand why we level here and why we roll. The better understanding you have of these decisions, the more you could apply these concepts to different scenarios. So finally, I'm going to talk about tempo, which is probably going to be the hardest skill in this list to master. And you might be asking yourself, what exactly is tempo? And I think tempo is a very, very loose term that a lot of players throw around, and the definitions for these could vary. But my personal definition of tempo is the ability to artificially manipulate your board strength relative to the strength of the lobby. For example, what is a high tempo lobby? One example of a high tempo lobby is on the first carousel if everyone starts with the fawn. In this case, everyone is probably going to level to 4 on turn 1 and they're going to have 5 units on board. In this case, they're going to be dealing 10 damage to each other per turn, leading to a very fast-paced game that ends a lot more quicker. Let's say you have a perfect Ezreal reroll opener. Do you play this? The answer is no, because the pace of a reroll comp is going to be a lot slower than the pace of a lobby full of players with Fawn. By the time you get your Ezreal comp online, you're probably going to be already dead. Similarly, A low tempo lobby is a lobby where all the players are mostly trying to econ. For example, let's just take a hypothetical lobby where 4 people have rich gets richer and 4 people have the AFK augment. This is going to be a very low tempo lobby because each player is probably going to be econing early game. They're going to be dealing very little damage to each other, and because everyone is weak, the fights are going to be very close, leading to 1 or 2 unit loses. And by the end of the game, everyone is going to be very strong because they have a lot of econ to work with. In lobbies like these, you either have to commit to a massive win streak to take advantage of this low tempo lobby, or you have to join them and play low tempo as well. Or else you're just going to get outscaled and not have enough econ to spike with them. Having good tempo is being very good at manipulating win and lose streaks. For example, if you're 4 lose into Krugs, you better make sure you lose that 5th round, because if you don't lose this 5th round, you're probably going to lose 15 gold in total. This is probably going to be a guaranteed bot 4, whereas if you actually lost this 5th round, it gives you a chance to come back. Similarly, if you're on a 5 win streak at 3-2, you might want to roll down a bit to hit your pairs to maintain your tempo, aka win streak. The key to having very good tempo is that when you're trying to lose streak, you want to make sure that you're the weakest in the lobby, but only by a little bit, because if you're too weak, you're going to take way too much damage. But if you're just a little bit stronger than the weakest person in the lobby, you're going to lose your lose streak, basically completely ruining your econ. Similarly, if you're win streaking, you don't want to be way stronger than the lobby. You want to be just strong enough so that you could beat each opponent, but not waste your excess gold, because you're going to need that excess gold for your next tempo swing. For example, if you look at this chart, let's say this red line is the lobby strength. If you're lose streaking, you want your power level to look something like this. You want to be exactly a little bit lower than the strength of the lobby so that you could minimize how much HP you take while maintaining your econ. And similarly, if you want to spike, you want to spike just enough so that you're a little bit stronger than the rest of the lobby and maintain the max amount of econ as possible. In my opinion, this is the core of what having good tempo is, and if you're below masters, you probably don't have to worry about this skill, but this is something you'll probably have to learn eventually if you want to make that push to grandmasters. It's a shame that mercenaries is no longer part of set 7, because I think mercenaries is the perfect comp to spam if you want to improve your tempo. So my tips on how you could get better tempo if you really want to improve on this skill is to make a smurf and only play from behind. What I mean from play from behind is you want to 5 lose into neutrals every single round. This way, you're forced to have a good tempo to be able to come back in the game. If you just play your strongest board every single game, in my opinion, you're never really going to get a good grasp of what tempo actually is and how it works. I think a lot of players think that reroll comps don't take a lot of skill. In my opinion, reroll comps are easy to learn, but are actually very hard to master, because you need a very good understanding of tempo to do well with reroll comps. So this just about sums up my guide. I know that this was a very long video, but it's very hard to try and be concise when we're talking about these 4 topics because they're very broad. I think if you guys enjoyed this video, I might consider making another video on flexibility and understanding how to play around EV. And if you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you subscribe to my channel. It's really helpful to me. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to leave a comment down below and I'll try my best to answer it. I hope you guys found this helpful, and I will see you guys next time.